This account is taken from the United States National Archives and is the US Army description of the preparations for D-Day at the port of Southampton. This first part describes the personnel and the loading of motor transports and coasters at Southampton, as well as the totals for the outloadings of POL products at Fawley and Hamble. Chapter 9. Southampton and the Southern Ports. The 14th port was located in Southampton, Hampshire, England, and operated, in addition to the area about Southampton, a sub-port at Poole and several other installations a short distance south of Southampton. The headquarters office was located at Allen's Sweet Shop, 181 High Street. In the absence of Colonel Walter D. McCord, who was performing additional duties as Regional Transportation Officer, Headquarters Southern Base Section, Lieutenant Colonel Leo J. Mayer was acting port commander. Colonel McCord, however, retained command of the port, dividing his time between this headquarters and Headquarters Southern Base Section. In April, the normal duties of the port were performed with some difficulty, inasmuch as 47% of the officer personnel and 30% of the enlisted personnel were on detached service. This condition was further aggravated by a considerable increase in port activities in preparation for coming events. As of the 26th of April 1944, the port was officially closed to import. May was a momentous month in the young life of the 14th port. This month marked the end of cargo discharge at the Southampton port, and at the same time set a new peak in D-Day preparations. Likewise, the strength of the 14th port and its attached units swelled to a new total of 5,229. Another May feature was the payment of the millionth dollar in reverse lend-lease by the British government for activities of the 14th port. One outstanding feature of the month was the establishment of the subport Poole, a suburb of Bournemouth. Activities of the subport included preloading of invasion craft, with supplies furnished by the Quartermaster, Ordnance, Engineer and Chemical Warfare Service. 10 barges were preloaded at Poole for France. This operation began on the 29th of May and was completed on the 31st of May. Labour was supplied by the 499th Port Battalion. 94 barges were preloaded at Southampton with cargo for France. This operation commenced on the 4th of May and was completed by the 26th of May 1944. Work was performed by the 499th Port Battalion. Barges were self-propelled landing barges and were supplied by the Admiralty. The Admiralty was unable to supply allocated barges at the beginning of the outloading programme due to adverse weather conditions. Others were substituted, with the result that difficulties arose. The substitute barges varied in size from those that were to have been received. Also, it was found that weight had been taken into account for pre-stowage, but that measurement had not been given proper consideration in all cases. As a result, certain cargo was shut out. The strength of the 14th port continued to grow during June. By the end of the month, the number of military personnel had risen to 5,153, and the total number of military and civilian personnel jumped to over 5,800. 2 new units, the 103rd and 104th Port Marine Maintenance Companies, joined the 14th port during June. Both were engaged in ship repair and maintenance. A marine repair and maintenance shop was established on the waterfront. Here the various harbour craft of the port were worked on and kept in running condition. The shop proved itself invaluable after the return of damaged craft from France. One other significant addition was that of more British civilian truck drivers to handle the increased transportation needs of Port Battalion stevedores. All activity of the 14th Port and its attached units during the month of June was directed towards D-Day and the intense period of movement following. Prior to D-Day, the port was aided in the loading of ammunition and POL craft. POL is the United States expression for petroleum, oil and lubricant products. With the arrival of D-Day, however, main efforts were directed towards fulfilling a daily schedule of outloading 12 motor transport vessels. On the 6th of June 1944, the port went on full invasion loading schedule. This activity fell into 2 parts. loading of vehicles and personnel on MTs, motor transport ships, and the loading of general stores on coasters. It was planned that the port would load and sail 12 MT vessels daily. These were Liberty ships that had been ballasted and lower hold floored off. Approximately 120 vehicles and 500 personnel were carried by each. This program beginning on the 6th of June 1944 and continued until the 21st of June. At that time loading was discontinued on the near shore because a severe storm made discharge impossible at the far shore. Motor transport loading was resumed on the 27th of June 1944. The coaster program began on the 11th of June 1944 with the outloading of POL and stores. Changes in far shore requirements made an alteration in the local program advisable, involving the diversion of POL shipments to other ports and the addition of ammunition shipments to this port. During the month of June, a tanker loading program was instituted at Hamble and Fawley, with officers at Hamble. The first tanker was loaded out on the 19th of June. This is the second part of an account taken from the United States National Archives of the U.S. Army describing the integration of port sections and attached units at the port of Southampton prior to D-Day and during Operation Overlord. It is only possible to present a skeleton idea of the vast amount of integration among the various services. One of the more obvious activities was that of the military police. Stationed at key points, they saved valuable time in allowing convoys to pass unbroken. Not only were they employed in the immediate waterfront area, but they also assisted the Southampton police in many cases by handling traffic at congested points outside the dock region. Besides this traffic control duty, military police carried out their routine guard duty on the waterfront, watching over precious invasion materials. They assisted in the movement of prisoners of war and in confiscating articles which the prisoners of war had on their persons. In one instance they apprehended foreign stowaways. To the two port battalions attached to the 14th Port, the 499th, which was commanded by Major Urquhart Taylor, and the 512th, which was commanded by Major James G. Buchanan, must go the bulk of the credit for the actual loading of the motor transports. These vessels, converted from American Liberty ships, amounted to vehicle ferry boats. In 4 of the 5 hatches on the standard Liberty ship, vehicles were loaded. The 5th hatch was reserved for the drivers of the vehicles. Vehicle loading required technical skill and patience far greater than that needed for ordinary cargo. Each vehicle had to be anchored within the hatch so that it would not roll or be tossed about when the ship was at sea. Much care had to be taken in the actual handling of the vehicles, inasmuch as many of them would become useless if vital portions were damaged during loading or unloading. Often working on as long as 30, 40 and 50 consecutive hours, these men showed great endurance in getting war material loaded for their brothers-in-arms across the Channel. Moving these port battalion stevedores to and from their work involved great effort. To fill the demand, additional British trucks and buses were obtained. Over 100 buses and trucks were used to transport over 2,000 men daily. Both the trucks and the wages of their drivers were provided for under reverse lend-lease. The 3890 truck company was kept busy during the month, 30% of its entire personnel being on night duty. Besides assisting in the movement of personnel of the 2 port battalions, the company also moved thousands of rations from nearby depots to the Southampton area. In one 3-day period alone, over 570,000 rations were hauled from Depot G47 to the port. During June, the company dispensed over 75,000 gallons of gasoline, and its vehicles travelled some 325,000 miles. Among the spectacular activities were those experienced by the 2 harbour craft companies making the cross-channel voyage. These 2, the 329th, Captain O.A. Jeffcoat commanding, and the 330th, Captain William S. Delafield, commanding officer, operated many small craft which towed Phoenix units, bridge spans and pierheads from shore waters at Southsea to sea-going tugs. The duties of these two organisations on the far shore consisted of 1. Pushing landing craft onto the beaches when the craft could not reach them alone because of tides or shallow waters. 2. Pulling the craft off the beaches when unloaded and when the craft themselves could not do so under their own power. 3. Placing Phoenix units, bridge units and pierheads which they towed across the channel in their proper positions. 4. Towing and placing special breakwater ships which later made up the beach harbour breakwaters. 5. Sea rescue work which, though not as planned part of the organisation's duties, was one of the more active types of duties on the far shore. So great was their contribution that letters of commendation were written by authorities both of the British and United States Navy. Although not a life was lost during all this activity, 9 of the 14th Port's small craft were heavily damaged, some beyond repair. One of the crews was credited with having destroyed an enemy plane. Great responsibility was placed on the port's quartermaster section during the month. Loaded on motor transport vessels with 645,000 10-in-1 rations, 70,000 K rations and lesser amounts of C rations. No motor transport left the port without its full quota of rations. The quartermaster made available to the invasion fleet some 368,000 gallons of diesel oil, 448,000 gallons of petrol and 39,000 gallons of lubrication oils. Over 6,000 army blankets were issued on motor transports. Of life preservers, 50,000 of the dual tube type were issued and 96,000 of the K-pop variety were distributed. While the aforementioned services contributed much to the invasion progress, no section or unit went without some contribution. For example, the signal section handled a 23% increase in teleprint messages and a 125% increase in ordinary messages. An added service of the signal section was that of forwarding all press correspondence from this area, as well as many from the Normandy scene. Ordnance personnel working on a 24-hour basis aided in the inspection and stowage of vehicles of motor transports. In addition, valuable assistance was rendered in the supervision of loading ordnance supplies aboard craft. The engineers constructed a new 14th Port headquarters and set up a 1,000-man mess in the Taunton School. In addition, the utility shop devised many of the blocks and other materials used in anchoring vehicles loaded on motor transports. The medical section supplied needed medical material for motor transports as well as for hospital ships and harbour craft. Red Bull medical supplies were handled through the cooperation of this section. The port surgeon also performed liaison duties with American hospital ships, discharging casualties here. The port veterinarian's office inspected rations loaded on vessels on a 24-hour basis. The port air office checked and tallied much Red Bull Air Corps supplies passing through the port. In addition, the Port Air Office was charged with facilitating trips to Normandy by authorised army personnel and war correspondents. The Chemical Warfare section helped supervise the loading of POL supplies, in addition to its routine duties involving CWS material. Many men not equipped with the required CWS equipment were supplied with the necessary material by the Port CWS office. In the final analysis, however, only the statistics revealing the number and types of ships loaded told the real activity of the port sections and attached units. This is the last part of a World War II US Army classified document from the United States National Archives entitled Southampton and Southern Ports, describing the run-up to D-Day. The most astounding comparison probably was that of the number of ships unloaded by the port since it had been overseas, placed alongside the number loaded out during the month of June. The total ships unloaded by the 14th Port in its year overseas was 220. The total outloaded during June was 215. These figures, however, did not reflect the true tonnage comparison. The total tonnage discharged was 509,000. That loaded in June was only 34,000. The obvious reason for the great difference was the relatively light weight of the vehicles loaded on motor transports. An officer courier service was inaugurated during June by the 14th Port for the purpose of expediting valuable ships' papers to the Normandy beaches. In the beginning, couriers used both Navy dispatch and planes. Presently, an efficient flying schedule assured rapid delivery of documents and a prompt return of the courier to his duties. Reverse Lend-Lease payments for shipping activities at the end of May totaled $1,016,000. During June, port operations were so great as to bring the total to over $1,225,000. This meant that June charges amounted to almost 25% of the entire previous year's total. The port's finance section suddenly found themselves dealing in francs when the invasion came. Wounded soldiers and returning glider navigators wanted their invasion currency reconverted to the British standard. An additional salvage project was that of reclaiming damaged motor transport and cargo vessels. These craft, damaged by underwater obstacles during their voyage to the French coast, were towed back to the port area and beached. Thereafter the salvage work began with the 499th Port Battalion furnishing the labour. Under the jurisdiction of the 13th Port, Colonel C. A. Noble commanding, the total discharge of cargo at the ports of Plymouth and Falmouth for April rose to 40,000 tons. This compared with a total of 32,000 tons discharged during the 8 weeks preceding the 1st of April, which represented an increase of 250% in the tonnage per week rate. 3 outstanding incidents occurred during May, namely the construction of a tent camp and opening of operations at the subport of Fowey, the setting up of a complete staff and strength for operations at the subport of Falmouth, and the completion of the barge programme at the yards of Totnes, Devon, where the construction of 400 wooden barges was completed 2 weeks ahead of the 1st of June target date. As per previously elaborated plans, the 13th Port undertook a programme of operational outloadings. The initial phase of this programme called for the loading of 12 dumb barges at 1,000 tons and 18 LCTs at 200 tons, a total of 15,600 tons according to pre-stowage plans. This entire phase was completed during May. During the period, normal discharge operations continued at a record rate. Plymouth discharged 40,892 tons from 51 ships and Falmouth discharged 8,732 tons from 6 ships, which made a total of 49,614 tons for 57 ships. These figures reflected one of the highest sustained rates of discharge operations experienced in the sub-ports, and it was of interest that this cargo was received and handled in spite of official notice having been received that further imports would cease. There was as many as 17 transatlantic craft discharging at a port during a single day. The average of tonnage discharged in the ports per day was 1,000. Operational outloadings in the sub-port Plymouth were divided into dumb barges and Navy LCTs. The sub-port Fowey handled dumb barges only. All craft were to be loaded according to pre-stowage plans. It was found that in almost all cases the pre-stowage plans exceeded the capacity of the craft. In the case of the barges, where an average of 1,000 ton per craft had been projected, it was necessary to increase the number of craft from the original 12 to 20 in order to accommodate the prescribed load. This was an underestimate of 40% of the carrying capacity. In order to handle the increased operations at all points, operational personnel was expanded more than double over the previous month. A special traffic group was organised to regulate the flow of land-borne cargo to the operational vessels and to prevent any conflict of congestion with the heavy counterflow of land traffic emanating from discharging operations. This was accomplished by ordering all incoming rail cargo, which constituted 99% of the total cargo moving for operational loading, into a marshalling yard and then calling it forward as required at the loading stations. On D-Day, loading of motor transport vessels began as scheduled. The first vessel was completed at 2300 hours, 6th of June, in 15 hours loading time. The first 3 vessels in the programme, 1 from Plymouth and 2 from Falmouth, cleared port and joined convoy at 0400 hours on the 8th of June. The first coaster in the store's build-up programme arrived in Plymouth on the 9th of June and loaded petrol. It sailed on the 11th of June with 373 tons. The first ammunition coaster arrived in Fowey on the 12th of June and sailed on the 16th of June with 825 tons. The loading time of motor transport vessels was progressively reduced until a record of 5 hours for 120 vehicles was achieved. Sailings of motor transport vessels were temporarily suspended for 5 days during the disastrous gale. Construction of steel 104 kd barges at the Hale yards and at Truro, Cornwall under the 13th Port supervision continued, with production figures totalling 253 barges. The problems attendant to operating 3 separate installations, London, Hull, Immingham, were evident to the 12th Port, with a constant shuttling of men and officers to and from the detachments and headquarters. Nevertheless, they surpassed all former operators of the port in the dispatch of cargo. During the first half of April, as listed on the comparative performance of overseas ports, this port had a standing of 2nd place in the UK in reference to net discharge data. However, the tonnage figures of this port decreased in proportion to the number of days to D-Day. During the period of 15th of May through the 21st of May 1944, a general reduction of files was dispatched in all sections, with all unnecessary papers being destroyed to bring the various administrative impediments to an absolute minimum, which in days to come would prove its benefits by being instrumental in attaining the goal of the organisation in its next move, that being to travel with the barest necessities of administration and not to be encumbered or retarded by unnecessary packing boxes. Preliminary preparations were carried through for the eventual moving of the organisation. This included the requisitioning of officers and enlisted men to bring the organisation up to strength, requisitioning of needed supplies, packing of all equipment not necessary in the administrative and operative branches of the unit was carried out, with the result that the entire organisation could be on the rails, wheels or water within 12 hours.